Okay, so with glacial processes, so this is our glacier. We're gonna pretend that this is a glacier. All right, we'll pretend that this is a continental glacier right now, even though it's very small. So with this continental glacier, we know that, again, with all processes, gravity drives them. Gravity drives them all. So when these glaciers move, they'll move downhill. Again, depending on if it is a glacial or an interglacial time period. So say we're at the end of a glacial period, things are melting and the glaciers are moving downhill. They'll literally push, they'll deposit, they'll erode, and they'll push sediment out of their way. They're taking out all the vegetation while they move. And in the end, we're left with what we call these moraines, right? So there's a moraine. These are basically, you can think of it as a river of ice moving downhill. And then let's say the glacier melted completely and it leaves this terminal moraine, or where that glacier stopped. So in Ohio, we have these types of features. We have glacial, the Great Lakes are glacially carved. So are the Finger Lakes in New York. There's a couple bogs in Kent that are left over from glacial processes. But with these glacial movements, you have usually one direction that they move. Now it's unlike water. With a river, rivers will again meander and they'll change course, right? You'll have meandering stream that changes course. But this doesn't happen with glaciers. Glaciers don't move on the landscape like this. They're not liquid water, they're solid. So a landforms left over from meandering streams are going to be different than glaciers. So let's flatten this out again. So again, say this is a glacier coming down from the north into to the United States from Canada. It's moving downhill, goes very slowly, and as it's moving, it's literally leaving marks on the landscape. It's not shifting around like a river does. It's eroding and it's depositing at the same time. But again, these are the moraines, and sometimes you'll have moraines called medial moraines down the middle of these glaciated areas too. And then you'll have these landforms up in the mountains that indicate where that glacier started. These cirques, C-I-R-C-Q-U-E. But it's literally like if you take your hand and you push, and it's like a handprint. So this is a glacial imprint left behind. And we can map out these moraines. Many times we know that there have been multiple glacial periods. So maybe this was the first glaciation, and then another glacial period came and maybe it moved in a little bit different of a direction. But again, we look at these leftover pieces, these moraines that are literally strips of sediment, strips of unconsolidated material, and at the end point here, and figure out, we can rewind the geological clock and figure out where the ice came from, which direction it moved, and where it stopped. So we have a ridge in northeast Ohio that is indicative of the last glaciation, the end of the, literally it's a ridge that runs through the state, and it's the edge of our basin too, our drainage basin. Anything north of this ridge will flow into Lake Erie. We'll say this is Lake Erie. Flow into this. And anything south of this ridge will flow into the Ohio River eventually. Lake Canton is south of this major ridge system. So this is running through northeast Ohio. You can draw it on a map, but this indicates where that glacier literally ended. You can also, like, say a glacier is moving and a big piece of ice just breaks off, right? The rest of the glacier keeps moving, but this piece of ice broke off and started to melt, that'll leave an imprint behind. And what we consider like a bog, there's bogs in Kent, but what's interesting about a bog is that there's really no in or outflow. It's just water that's just kind of sitting there, and they have life cycles too. There's a life cycle to bogs, but they have particular types of vegetation, some like different flora and fauna that are like indigenous to these types of bogs. So we have bogs here in Northeast Ohio too. We have that ridge, and we have two drainage basins being separated in the north and the south. Remember, the Great Lakes system has its own drainage basin. So glaciation, again, think about that glacier being a solid mass moving across the landscape, and think too that is any vegetation going to survive a glacier moving over top of it? I mean, we're talking really, really thick ice moving across the landscape. So this is why we don't have a lot of really old growth forests in Northeast Ohio too. And we have some, but you know, there are areas that might have been too high and the glacier went around it, kind of. So maybe some old growth forests, but a lot of our trees, you know, they're not like areas in non-glaciated parts of the world. So that is glaciers.